Hello and welcome to the Psychohealthology Summit 2018. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm your host, Dr. Detko, and my guest for this session is Gina Ross. Gina is founder and president of International Trauma Healing Institutes in both the United States and in Israel, and the co-founder of the Israeli Trauma Center at Herzog Hospital in Jerusalem. An internationally known expert on the impact of trauma in conflict between groups and nations, Gina has specialized in cutting-edge healing methods that can be brought to the public. Gina and her institutes work diligently to place the issue of trauma healing on the global agenda, developing resources and collaborating with organizations to further healing at the community, national and international levels, which is work so needed these days. So Gina, welcome to the Psychohealthology Summit. So great to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Eva, for inviting me.
So I wanted to start by asking you, because your expertise is not just in trauma, but it's actually collective trauma, which we will talk a little bit more about during the interview. But it's just always interesting to know how people end up in this area of work. So do you mind sharing a story with us?
Yes, of course. I would love to share it. I actually was doing therapy, and I was very interested in spiritual therapy for quite a few years. And then I realized that if people had trauma in their lives, if they were traumatized by the events in their lives, it was very hard for them to access spirituality. So I realized that if I wanted the spiritual work to happen, I would need to look at trauma first. And that wasn't at all my intention in the beginning. And as I started looking into that, and there was some very interesting research that was done about the tremendous cost of trauma to society, I got very interested in the topic in a way that I'd never imagined. I just wanted to do spiritual therapy and help people get along in their relationships and family systems and all of that. And then I realized something much deeper was going on in people's lives that we needed to attend to.
That is actually so true. That can be such a block for people to experience, sort of get to the higher levels of consciousness if they've got this sort of trauma basically messing with their heads on a daily basis. Because for a lot of people, if they had early childhood trauma or trauma even later on in their lives, it's something that can literally interfere with every aspect of their lives. And so yes, that's definitely so true. So we're talking about trauma a lot here, so perhaps we should just start with defining trauma. And you've done such a good job of doing exactly that in your book.
Yeah, I will summarize it briefly. My book is based really on somatic experiencing, a technique that was created by Dr. Peter Levine. And I'm one of his senior trainers, and I introduced somatic experiencing in the Middle East, as you said that. And what was most relevant, I think, and most exceptional in the technique, in the theory of the technique, was that trauma was actually in the body. Trauma had to do not just with the event itself, but with the encounter between the event and the person's autonomic nervous system and the state that it was in at that particular moment. So for example, two people could go through the same event at the same time and they would have very different reactions. The same person could go through the same event at different times and have a different reaction, depending on what was happening with their autonomic nervous system. So that put it like outside of character, traits, willpower, capacity, skills. It really had to do with what was happening in the body first. And that destigmatized trauma a lot. Like my clients would say, oh, it's like I have a cold, or I have cancer, or I have something in my lungs. Oh, that is so much better than to think that something is deeply wrong with me as a human being and in my mind. So that definition by itself already was very important to bring a lot of hope into the treatment of trauma. The nervous system has been affected. There's excess energy in the body that needs to be discharged. The stress hormones that came up did not get discharged. They need to be discharged. And the movements of defense that needed to be completed did not get completed. And that's it. It made it extremely simple and viable and not scary. Okay, there's not something wrong, deeply wrong with my mind.
Yeah, I think that's a really big thing, because it's true that people can give themselves a hard time for that reason, that they think that they're somehow deficient, or there's, as you said, there's something fundamentally wrong with them. And exactly, if you put it in that way, it just immediately it takes the pressure off. And so, and as we know, this can happen to anyone at any time. And so it doesn't make anybody sort of worse or deficient in any way for having those experiences. And I think that you're right, that is massively helpful to people to know that.
And out of that also, knowing that it has to do with the state of the autonomic nervous system, it was like, oh, maybe there's something to do about that. I can check what is the state of my nervous system on an ongoing basis. I can take it to homeostasis. I can regulate it every day. I can practice my emotional muscles the way I practice my physical muscles. And that was really the other discoveries, like, oh, not only I don't need to like think I'm crazy, but actually I've got something I can do, and I can do by myself also on a daily basis.
Obviously, people will have some idea on the effects that trauma can have. We talked on a number of occasions what the effects of trauma on the system, the immune system function, the microbiome, various other things we sort of got. But do you sort of want to just summarize the different effects that trauma can have on both mind and body?
It's actually so overwhelming to see how much of it can happen, how much of it can be affected. So first of all, for example, at the thinking level, our neocortex can stop functioning in the right way and become pretty irrational. And we can go into a lot of black and white thinking, or polarized thinking, or obsessive thoughts, recurrent thoughts of danger all the time that we cannot control. Negative thoughts that take over our mind, and there's nothing, it seems that there's nothing we can do about it. At the emotional level, we're reacting from a very exaggerated, inappropriate way to any stimulus that's happening in our environment. A look from somebody, a word that we think we interpreted in the wrong way, and we're gone. We call it our amygdala hijacked. Or we get very numb, we dissociate because it's too scary to even face what's going on. So that would be at the emotional level. At the physical level, all kinds of different physiological things are happening. We can have flashbacks, we can have tantrums, we can have panic attacks, we can have tachycardia, we can have a lot. Actually, if trauma happens in the body and does not get healed for many years, we can develop real syndromes, real illnesses that manifest as illnesses, and they're actually just an expression of a very dysregulated autonomic nervous system, and including things like fibromyalgia, like chronic fatigue, like digestive problems, circulatory problems, cardiac problems. I mean, it's amazing how much can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, yeah, so the whole host of autoimmune conditions here, clearly, which you mentioned fibromyalgia, which there's still some debate whether it is or isn't autoimmune, but, you know, a lot of people agree that it is. But there's just such an awful lot of those conditions now that, in fact, people believe, some researchers are saying that pretty much all chronic conditions are autoimmune and at their very core. And what I see in my work, you know, working with people with chronic conditions, is that there's always something going on at the emotional level. But what I want to go back to for a second, because we were defining trauma, and I'm keen for people, this is something that has been said before, but what I'm keen for people to understand is that they can be displaying those symptoms as you just described. So for example, they could be dissociated, or they could be in this state of hypervigilance all the time. And when they sort of think back, that they're not necessarily going to identify this one big trauma that happened to them. But of course, we know that there's so many different types of trauma, right? So, things like attachment and developmental trauma. So what I'm saying is, I need people to kind of understand that trauma isn't just a sort of one big dramatic thing. It comes in many shapes and forms, really. So do you want to actually just speak to that for a moment?
Yeah, it comes in many shades. So we call it small t trauma and big T trauma. Big T trauma would be what we already understand, for example, like rape or assault or war. Small T trauma could be a car accident, a diagnosis of an illness, a sudden loss. So the real thing that we need to understand is that anything that overwhelms our capacity to cope becomes traumatic. That's really the issue, is when I'm feeling helpless and out of control, and I cannot measure what's happening in my life and take the right decisions for my life and function in the proper way. This is what we're calling trauma. It does not have to be something otherworldly. It does not have to be a natural disaster. It does not have to be war. It does not have to be a bomb. It's enough that something that overwhelmed me for whatever reason, and I cannot cope anymore. Now, there's something also that's very tricky about trauma, is that there are triggers that happen. For example, if a traumatic event happens, let's say at 5 o'clock in the morning, and it's in the winter, these conditions of winter and 5 o'clock in the morning could become triggers of their own now. And then anything else that I'll do at 5 o'clock in the morning in the winter will be added to those trigger. And so we can have several generations of trigger, and people may not recognize that something happened in their lives. They don't know why they're getting triggered in that way, but actually it's because there are several generations of trigger, and the initial trauma has been dissociated because it was too hard to cope with, too much activation in the system. So a partial amnesia or total amnesia of an event can be behind what the inability to say where that comes from. Where are our symptoms from?
It is a protective mechanism, right? So that's, again, it's not something that is wrong, that goes wrong in the body or in the mind. It's just a coping mechanism. So again, so people don't give themselves a hard time about it. But it is so common that people, when something happens that is just too much, that this will occur. People will just not have a sort of, as you say, working memory of that, but yet they will go through their lives being triggered and being in those, being hypervigilant or being dissociated, not being able to connecting with their emotions properly or people around them and things like that. So it's, when people experience that, it's important for them to be thinking, well, what is at the root cause of this? Why am I reacting in this way? Well, because there's always a reason. So that's, again, just don't want people to give themselves a hard time or think that they're crazy. If they have those sort of reactions, there's always a reason for it, isn't there?
Yeah, it's actually something that goes right, but it should have been only momentary. The fact that it remains that way, then that means that those stress hormones cannot be discharged. So the understanding that you want to give them is very important. So what happens, there are 3 responses to threat. Is fight, flight, and freeze. If those responses are stuck for whatever reason, they don't get completed, any one of them. Because like if I cannot fight or flee, my body's going to go into freeze, and that could include dissociation. Then what happens, now I'm going to react to everything that happens from that space, from the freeze space, or from the interrupted fight phase, or from interrupted flight phase response, which means that now I'm just operating on automatic. I'm just reacting from something that I have no idea what's going on. There are all these triggers around me that I'm not necessarily aware of. Now, there is a very good news that I can give you, is that even if you don't remember the story, even if you don't know what happened, we can access the traumatic material through the symptoms and help it discharge. So let's say something happened when a baby was very young, or it was pre-verbal, or it really went into amnesia that should not be recovered for whatever reason. The fact that the symptoms actually are not a sign of illness, but a sign of where that energy was stuck in the system, we can go after that energy and discharge it. And what we have found is that if we do that in small quantities, then the proper self-regulatory mechanism that every human being has in their autonomic nervous system can be put to function again in a normal way. What happens is that these self-regulatory mechanisms just got overwhelmed and they're not functioning properly anymore. And what somatic experiencing did is bring up these principles that if we follow them, can get those mechanisms to work again.
Yes, and that's that's actually a really great point. And so, and just talking a bit more about the different, that obviously trauma can be less severe, more severe. So just could you talk a little bit more about the different factors that can actually affect how severe the trauma is?
So the earlier in age it is, the most severe it can be. The less human resources people have, the worse it will be. So for example, we can go through very, very traumatic events, but if we're supported in the right way, if people have witnessed and supported and validated what we're feeling and helped us go through them, we may very well get out of the traumatic phase just through that. Our own resources, but what happens though, the problem is that trauma by definition cuts us off from our personal resources, body resources, social resources, and spiritual resources. That's one of the biggest danger of trauma, that if we understand that, then we start connecting again, even if it doesn't feel like we want to do it, with things that were resourceful for us before. I remember Peter working with somebody who was in 9/11, and her resources were music, friends, and she said, but I don't feel like it right now. I don't want to do that. This is not what I feel like. And the fact, understanding that that's exactly what trauma does, is cut you off from it, and you actually should connect back to the music because that was a resource for you, changes how we help ourselves get out of the traumatic events. So resources are fundamental, both personal resources and outside resources. And outside resources include family, relatives, friends, social networks, for example, clergy, anything in society that can be a support group is very helpful. There is that part, but also like engaging in our personal resources, like what are the things that we like? What are the things that take us out of ourselves? What are the things that when we think about them, something different just walks into our nervous system? There's a calmness that happens. There's an openness. There's an expansion that takes place. Well, every time I resource myself and I bring that list of resources into my mind and I ground them in my body, like what do I notice in my body when I think about this resource? I am right now empowering my healing vortex, my ability to heal that is built into my system. I'm reminding it that, oh, it knows what to do. Here it is. Let me give it a little tip here again. And so resources are very, very important. And what I meant by grounding a resource in the body is truly thinking like, what happens in my body when I think about that? So in my case, I often use my grandchildren. So immediately when I think about them, there's a smile in my face. A breath comes in, there is an opening in my chest. Something is like, okay, I just want to go and give them a kiss right now. That's it. You know, there's something that's like wholesome and pleasant and open and expanded. And those are the characteristics of the healing vortex. The opposite is really the trauma vortex. I'm tight and constricted and I have pain and I don't want to talk to anybody and I want to isolate and I feel really bad. And that's another thing. Feeling bad feels right in trauma. We think we cannot change it, but it is changeable. Or if I'm feeling bad in my body and in my mind, then I think, well, something is wrong with me. That means I'm also bad. No, it doesn't mean that. It means that I just feel bad. I'm in the trauma vortex and I need to get out of it. And there are so many ways to get out of the trauma vortex today. There are like 15 amazing short-term techniques called power therapies that help people get out of it. A few of them you can do on your own, like the emotion aid that I wanted to mention to you. It's a tool that we teach in a few hours. People have learned it from the book itself. Some people are capable of just taking that information and put it together for themselves. It's really amazing. It's wonderful to see. We've developed exercise cards. The moment that you know the technique, we have cards that show you the 5 steps, remind you anytime and anywhere you are that you can use them. And one more thing I want to tell you, we've developed a CD called Brushing Your Nervous System. And every night you go and you look over your day and see what went well and you ground it in the body, and what went wrong, you take each event by itself and you discharge it from your nervous system. So there is a way to develop resiliency. There is a way to develop coping mechanisms and to really assure avoidance of traumatization even when traumatic events are taking place. We do not have to be at their mercy.
Yes, because of course we've got the traumas that have already happened and we want to clear them. But yes, it obviously is very important that we recognize that we can build neurological resilience, so then going forward we're actually less susceptible potentially to any traumatic events, and our response is different because we are neurologically stronger if we're applying those techniques and we use those tools that you mentioned. So could you talk a little bit more about your emotional aid technique, is it?
Yes, yes. So one of the things that we do is teach people how to resource themselves. We have them do like a list of 10 resources, and then they pick 1 or 2 and they ground them in the body. So I think about this resource. I talk about my grandkids. I can talk about my garden, which right now I'm looking at it, and all the love that my husband has put in it and how much my clients enjoy it. And that, again, there is like something lifting up. What's happening in my body, really? What's going on in my sensations, in my inner sensations? So there is, again, the smile. My eyes are kind of like more open, even a little bit wet with emotion about it, or like the breath is coming up again. And there's certain warmth in my stomach right now when I'm thinking about it. So every time I go into my body to notice what's happening when I'm thinking about the resource, something that I enjoy that calms me down or makes me feel stronger, then right now I'm just strengthening my nervous system. So that's by itself, that's one thing. The other thing that I can say is very important is for me to learn to notice what are the first signs of activation. How do I know that something just bothered me? What do I do? Do I swallow hard? Do I feel my heart sinking? Do I get red? Do I get flushed? Do I get tense? Do I just like my eyes start darting all over the place? What happens? What are the first signs? And then I start paying attention to what my body is telling me. We call it the felt sense, like really knowing what's in the internal landscape. What's happening right now inside of me? Just a squeeze in my stomach. What's that about? So I can go in and interview that squeeze. Oh, well, I just didn't like what that person said, and I'm not sure I can yell at them back because they may hurt me, or they may not want to talk to me anymore, or whatever is going on. Okay, now that I know that and I'm in my felt sense, I take a moment, I stop, and the breath comes in by itself. So giving time to one sensation at a time. This is the key. This is really the trick. Giving time to every sensation that comes up, one at a time, so that the autonomic nervous system brings its own release. And it looks in different ways, like it could be a deep breath that comes by itself, a yawn, shaking or trembling, a heat wave, warm sweat, gurgling in the stomach, and goosebumps. Those are signs that my nervous system is actually getting rid of that hormonal energy that was stuck in my system. And I take it one sensation at a time, go to the next one, go to the next one, until I feel like, oh, okay, I'm fine right now. I can handle this. Yeah, why am I giving it so much importance? The funny thing about it, every time I clear my nervous system, my mind gets cleared up. It starts thinking positive. It starts thinking in a creative way. It starts finding the solutions that work for me. I start functioning again. So really, a nervous system that's agitated and overly activated is not going to help me do what I need to do in the world. That's the first thing to know. And I have ways to put it back into place, to center it back. And it's quite amazing how much happens when I don't get overwhelmed anymore. And how do I do that? I have another trick. I never take several things at the same time. Never several sensations at the same time. Never several issues at the same time. The key, one at a time. One at a time, my nervous system has the opportunity to digest it, to assimilate what it needs, and everything clears up because of the body-mind connection. I clear up my body, my mind clears up. I clear up my mind, my body clears up. So we have these two-way streets that we can do it. But when we are in the throes of trauma, clearing up our mind through the mind only doesn't work well enough. That's why we go into the body, because there is a huge amount of messages of threat coming out from the body, feeling so overwhelmed and so full of stuck energy in the body from the stress hormones. So I need to clear it up at the body level. And time, and what I mean by time, a half minute more, a minute at the max, just stopping and being present to what's going on right now in this sensation, let's say in the tightness in my chest, and paying attention to the discharge that comes up and giving it all the space that it needs, giving it the whole time that it needs. This is it. It really, actually, it's so little. Once we learn it, it's so organic and so simple that we wonder, well, what just happened? Why didn't I know that before? Well, we knew it. We're using it all the time. Our body is designed to cope with trauma. But when it forgets for whatever reason, because it got overwhelmed, because of history, prior trauma, or we were sick, or things were not functioning for us at that moment and we got overwhelmed, we just have to put the whole system to work again. That's really the key of emotion aid.
Fantastic. That's really great. And I was, as you were talking, I was just wondering whether you have any sort of maybe additional advice to people who are currently, because perhaps they had something severe happening to them in the past and they are so dissociated that they have a really hard time going into the body and connecting with what they're feeling. Oftentimes they may be just reluctant to do it because they're scared of what may come up. So do you have sort of any advice for those?
I think that's when they need professional help, at least in the beginning, because somebody who has dissociated is because the traumatic energy went so high up that they needed to protect themselves. But now the whole system is stuck on that, and there isn't enough reassurance from the person itself that's stuck there to be able to say, oh, come on, to go dumb, to come out of it. And that's where they need the presence of another person, the skills of another person. So I would advise then to call a therapist and do a few sessions in the beginning. And then, for example, with my clients, within the third session or sometimes the second session, I'm already teaching them how to do emotion aid on top of what we're doing together. Because therapy with me is 1 hour a week. Now they can have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hours a week with themselves. So that's a very big adjunct. But when something has been seriously compromised in somebody's life, I would advise that they seek the help of somebody. And with the help of emotion aid and any of the other techniques that do some kind of emotion aid too, they can go much faster. Therapy does not have to be lengthy anymore. It does not have to take a lot of resources and many years and going on again and again and again. It's very different, because what happens is, let's say you had 15 traumas and I was able to help you digest one trauma. Well, guess what? Now your nervous system knows what to do for the others. It's got the right conditions met. You don't have to spend another 15 years dealing on one trauma one by itself each time. Because we're not working on the trauma. We're working on the centering of the autonomic nervous system and giving it back its balance and its capacity to really move through difficult events by using all the resources that are in the system, both the body and the mind, and then the surroundings. And of course, there's also the spiritual resources that people can use, which are incredibly effective for the people who do believe in that and who do use those skills. And one of the things that I want to say is, like, a family, for example, who is dealing with a traumatized person end up being traumatized themselves if they don't know what to do and how to take care of themselves. And that's what we'll call secondhand trauma. And that can end up being as problematic as firsthand trauma. So everybody in the system, like a teacher in a class and a parent of a child, or the parents or the siblings or the grandparents or anybody in the community around a person who's been traumatized, who understand what trauma is and react to it in a way that they don't blame the person for it, but they understand, this person right now is reacting from the trauma vortex. How do we bring the healing vortex to them? We change the whole social environment that way. So this information needs to be pervasive, I think, in all of society. And my institute has designed a model that we call the Ross model, how to take emotion aid and the awareness, the understanding of trauma, its impact, and then how to change this into 10 different social sectors that interface with trauma. Either create trauma or help heal it, or both at the same time, which is more likely both at the same time. And that's how we can really, I think, address eventually collective trauma. Because collective trauma is behind violence, behind war, is behind polarization that is extreme, where we just are obsessed with what's going on and we can't figure out the other side as human or normal or appreciate anything about them. This polarization that's happening right now, to me, is very much indicative of a collective trauma vortex going on, that if people really become aware of that, most people involved in this are very well-meaning people. And if they get involved with that and they start realizing, oh my God, this is real polarization, how do I step back out of that? How do I regulate myself so that I can bring some different dialogue into the system, different ways of finding solutions that we can all participate in, instead of just the labeling and the insulting and the threatening that's happening right now. This awareness, this simple awareness of what trauma is and what it does to us, and having the presence of mind to recognize it, having the knowledge, and then also the desire to recognize it, knowing that there is a way out, knowing that we can get out of it, I truly believe can be totally transformational. I think it's the key for what our civilization is asking for. How to make room for everybody, and for open heart, and for kindness, and for solution-oriented issues. Not to get stuck in things that we just go over and over and over and fight and fight and fight and complain and complain and complain and attack and attack and attack, and yet no solution is provided because we can't go to balance. We can't go to the center. We can't look at the whole issue from all the perspectives and figure out solutions for it. And we are all so stubborn and so convinced that the side that we have taken is the right side and the only right side. And I think that this is really the most important task in front of us. All of us, people of goodwill who really care about the country and about the world and about everybody in the country, how to not demonize, how to not dehumanize, how to try to understand what's happening, and how to look at every single side of an issue. Because everybody's holding a piece of the gold, a kernel of the truth for the totality. And only trauma hides it. Only trauma covers up the goodwill. Only traumatic activation and despair, that the despair that it brings, makes people feel so helpless. And helplessness creates a lot of rage. And rage, the next step to rage is violence.
I honestly couldn't agree more that when we're looking at the sort of on the global level at all the issues, whether it's to do with violence and the other things that you mentioned, we can actually, when we break it down at the very bottom of it, at the very core of it, is a traumatized individuals, a traumatized individual more often than not. And so if we were to bring those conversations sort of more into the mainstream, as you obviously are trying to do with your work, I think that is really exactly where we need to be. And you're right that this is what the world is crying out for, really. So that is just such an important aspect of it. Just because I know that collective trauma is a passion of yours, and you specialize in that. So could you just tell us more about the sort of work that you're doing?
When a group becomes traumatized, now we have huge forces that are aligned to feed the trauma vortex, and we have collective narratives that become distorted or very fixated on only aspects of the trauma and not of the healing. We have the media becomes at the service of this narrative. The education becomes at the service of this narrative. The arts are put at the service of this narrative. And now we have a huge reinforcing of a collective trauma vortex that inevitably will take people to war. Because when I'm in the trauma vortex, I cannot be feeling dangerous and wanting to be friendly at the same time and wanting to connect at the same time. If I'm feeling hypervigilant, I'm not letting you close in. I don't want to hear you. I don't want to have anything to do with you. I don't want to hear what you have to say. I don't have any patience or understanding or space for that. So I cannot be in hypervigilance and in danger and in anger and in hatred and serve anything good in the world. It's impossible. So when we talk about caring means getting out of trouble first. Is having a control over the rage that we're feeling and the powerlessness that we're feeling, so that then we can have a healthy anger that tells us, well, this part is not right. Something needs to be changed. And then we go and we affect the change and we work with it. But when we're overcharged and overwhelmed by hatred and rage, even those amazingly good intentions become perverted. They become spoiled. I have people, when I teach my courses, I do courses on where I present emotion aid and conflict resolution. And the people that approached me, they said, please help us. We are such good people. We're so well-intended. We're so compassionate. And yet we've become activists and we've taken up causes, and we find ourselves being so angry and so full of hatred and rage and despair. And I said, that's it. That's right. And we're not succeeding in what we're doing. And of course, we can't succeed in what we're doing when we're coming from the trauma vortex. I don't care how noble our purpose is, our cause is. It doesn't matter. How am I coming across? What am I bringing as energy into the world? You know, I come out of the house to go into my car, and I remind myself, what kind of a Gina I'm taking out right now? Will I let somebody pass in front of me, or will I honk violently? Will I let somebody break in front of me at the supermarket, or will I say, how dare you, break into the line? What would I do? Who am I coming out into the world? And it's the same thing about our political views and about the causes that we adopt and we espouse. All causes are good. I don't know anybody on any side almost that, if they're not in the trauma vortex, don't have some legitimate aspect to them, that's some concerns that have to be taken into consideration. Things become really bad at all levels for everybody when people become stuck in the trauma vortex. And the collective trauma vortex gets reinforced, as I said, by all of these different forces coming in and feeding it incessantly. And we forget, we lose our center. We forget that we are people that normally reach out. I mean, I've had people who don't talk to their families anymore. We've had couples who have divorced over political opinions. We've got people now that are being haunted wherever they go. We think that everything is viable right now. It doesn't matter. There is no more civility. There is no more politeness. There is no more caring. There is no more compassion. There is no more looking at the other and seeing that they're still human even if we don't agree with them. It's just gone. And I find this worrisome, but I understand that it's the trauma vortex. And I think if we bring that awareness, I think people are well-meaning and they can wake up and say, wait a second, let me get my balance back. Let me do this in the right way. Let me try to bring the change in a way that's feasible, that's not going to create more backlash. Because here's the thing. I don't know, even a doctor, if you give too much of a good thing, more than the container can handle, it's going to go bad. It's not going to work. So everything has to be measured and titrated and done intelligently. When I say something, I know it's correct, I know it's true, but who am I saying it to? Am I saying it in a way that the other person is going to hear it correctly? Will they be able to interpret it in the right way? Or am I going to use one word that will feed their mistrust and their disgust? So that's what I'm talking about in terms of what kind of self-regulation we need to bring back to the table. First in our own nervous system, and then in our own thinking, of course, it will be impacted by our nervous system, and vice versa too. And then take it out into the world through action that is well-meaning, but also effective, powerful for the good, not powerful for the backlash. I guess that's my message.
And you know what, and I love it. And I knew that when I asked you this question, that it will soon become evident to everybody watching, is that we all have a role to play in this. So we're not looking at collective trauma as something that happens in some parts of the world and it's nothing to do with us, because the point is that we all have our role to play in this. And if we have that self-awareness, and if we do self-regulate and just sort of step back rather than just react, just think about, do we, as you mentioned before, do we dehumanize? The way we maybe speak about other people with different opinions, all of those things. It's important that we start with ourselves, because this is going to spread, and we're going to have a much healthier society as a result of that. And of course, if we have a mentally healthier, an emotionally healthier society, we've got a physically and biochemically, this all impacts physical health as well. And if people are just unhappy and traumatized all the time, they are going to be sicker. So there's so many parallels and peripheral sort of effects of all that, isn't it? But it does start with an individual.
Absolutely. And I like to think of one tip for myself and for other people. It's like, the moment that I'm labeling people instead of discussing the issues and the arguments that they're giving me, I already know that I'm in full polarization. I actually wrote an article, I would love to send it to you, about polarization and how to recognize whether we are polarized or not. That I think can be very helpful. So people can follow that, they can ask for it, and they can just take the test, look at the list and say, where am I in this? Am I involved in this? Am I doing this? And then knowing that there are tools available. Awareness is amazing how much it does, just consciousness, awareness of, oh, I see. Wow, I can look at it this way. And would I not want a better way? Would I not want a more loving, compassionate way? Would I not want to be able to really enjoy the world and my life and everybody around me, and then get into healthy arguments and even big pow in terms of commentary and stuff like that, but still stay connected? Can I have an argument and still stay connected? This is really the key. And that's what we tell parents. It's not that you cannot say no to your kid. Of course you can say no. Of course you can reprimand, but always stay connected. And then they'll take it as knowing what they have to follow as a really good guideline for life. That's the whole difference, isn't it? So we're all little kids at some level that could use just a loving kindness from each other to look at what we're not seeing enough of, and expand our mind, expand our understanding, expand the causes that we care for. So, you can have a lot of this answer. We're refurbishing our website, but still you can access us through www.traumainstitute.org, and can call also the Institute at 323-954-1400. And you can access our books and can ask for trainings and for anything that you need. We really would like to spread this. Today we have social media. Can you imagine if we find the right, bright kids that can help us do that? How we can get emotion aid go viral, balance go viral, getting out of polarization go viral. Wouldn't that be amazing? We can use it for that, and I'm hoping that that's what's going to happen in the next few years. But thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. That's very lovely to talk to you today.
Oh, Gina, it's an absolute pleasure talking to you. And yes, there's a lot of food for thought here. And yeah, again, we all have to think about the little things we do or don't do that actually make a difference overall to not just our lives, but everybody else around us and globally, what impact we actually having. Because people generally don't think that as an individual they can have a wider impact, but we do have that impact. And as you said, if things like this went viral, then that's when you really see it, that you do have an impact.
That's right.
So that's
right.
wonderful. Thank you so much for all these lovely messages. We thank you so much. We appreciate you being here so much. So thank you, Gina.
Thank you. Bye-bye.